Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first of a new webinar series for 2021. This is actually the first webinar we've done this year. I guess we could have done one last week, but today we're going to be talking about the education vertical for private networking, 5G, 4G, etc. My name is Ian Gillett from IGR, and we have a couple of speakers today. Ray Sabarin from Nokia and Jim Jacobellis from Geoverse. I'll introduce them in a second here. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. We are being recorded today. We will make the recording available in a day or two. It'll be up on the website. We'll send you details on that. And we also will be taking questions today. So if you look on the GoToWebinar control panel, there's a questions tab. It's about halfway down. If you just type in the questions you've got there, then we'll address them as we go through as appropriate. The first question is, can we get the slides? Yes, we'll send details out on those as well. So I'll deal with that one. But ask any questions, we'll work them into the time we've got. In terms of who we're speaking today, as I said, my name is Ian Gillett from IGR. We're doing this as part of a new effort we have called the 2030 Project. We actually have a website up, enterprise5g.live. Last year's webinars we did for enterprise website. We've kind of merged those two together and kind of moved things onto a 5G discussion. So if you check out enterprise5g.live, there's details on there. There's also more details on the series of webinars we'll be doing. Geoverse, Nokia, and others will be back for those as well over the next few months. So first introduction is with Nokia, is with Ray Sabarin, who is biz dev for private wireless networks, enterprise and web scale accounts. So I guess he has a big business card, fit it all on. And then Jim Jacobellis is VP in Solutions, or VP of Solutions and Business Partners for Geoverse. Ray's up in the Dallas area, I'm in the Austin area, and Jim's out in Phoenix somewhere, right? Is that right? Arizona? Yeah, all right. In terms of what we're going to do today, just very quickly, first thing I'll ask each of them to just introduce themselves a little bit, what they do with private networks. You probably know both companies, but then we'll talk about use cases. So what is it that education can do with 5G, with private networks from K through 12, from a higher ed point of view? There's obviously a lot happening right now. And then we'll talk about communications needs, how you accomplish this. So we've got the use case, how you accomplish it, how they procure, what the processes go through for that, and then lessons learned, how best to deploy, but also how to operate this network. If an ISD, a school district, is going to build a network, for example, well, somebody's got to run it. And then we'll summarize, and then, as I said, open up for questions, any that are left at the end. Firstly, I'm going to set the stage a little bit here, just two very quick slides. I've shown this one before, but this is kind of the world as we see it from our point of view. This is for the 4G, 5G world in a few years, where basically everything is connected, from streetlights to commercial space. Obviously, manufacturing is on here as well. And you see on the top right there, we've got the home. You can put the school obviously in there as well. And basically everything is covered with a 5G network. And obviously that's increasingly happening today, depending where you are, where you live in the country or the world. The yellow areas are more local networks. They could be high capacity millimeter wave networks, for example. It also could be CBRS, private network. So if you look down at the manufacturing transportation area down the bottom left, you see a factory with a private network there. The stadium, when we used to go to football games and all those things we used to do, have a private network around it as well. And so what we're going to be talking about is, in this context, talking about the education market for this. Obviously, you can have a private network for a school. It could be K through 12. It could be for higher education, university. It may extend out into the community as well to provide connectivity. And all those things we'll talk about today. The other thing is a lot of the questions we got when we're setting this up, when people registered, they could put in questions. A lot of them were, well, how big is the opportunity? And we get this one a lot. It's a hard question to answer right now because obviously this is still relatively nascent. But I did pull actually, ironically, we were actually preparing a whole new set of forecasts and numbers for this vertical. And I pulled some data this morning. So this is for the US education market. The chart on the left shows the number of buildings in thousands. So if you look, 2018, there's about just under 440,000 buildings that identified as education buildings. Now, that doesn't mean there's 440,000 schools, that means there's 440,000 buildings. So if you've got a school with 3 or 4 buildings, for example, obviously that's going to count 3 or 4 times. This data comes from the government, from CBEX. They do a great job of categorizing buildings and the size of those buildings. They don't forecast it. We built the forecast, and you can see here out to 2026. So one of the things you see here is that, yes, there's growth. By 2026, we're looking at getting up to 490,000 buildings. The growth rate actually is slowing a little bit compared to what we've seen in the past. The chart on the right is the size of those buildings, and it's actually a big number, 14 billion square feet. The average size of a school is 33,000 square feet. So if you multiply everything out, that's what you sounds big, but then you think of your local elementary, your local high school. Our high school's huge. Think of the size of your house and then multiply it up. You can see that a high school could easily be more than 100,000 square feet, for example. But what's interesting here is schools are actually getting bigger. So the square footage to be covered actually is increasing faster than the number of buildings. So you can look at it that we've got 440,000, 450,000 buildings to cover. You can look at it, we've got all that square footage to cover. Either way, it's a big opportunity for private networks, 4G, 5G, etc., and everything we're going to talk about today. So that's to put everything into context. So with that, let's move on. And Jim, I'll pass over to you if you want to talk about Geoverse and what you guys do.
Sure thing, Ian. Thank you. So Geoverse, not quite as big as Nokia, but we're still a decent sized company, and we're actually a wholly owned subsidiary of a publicly traded entity that goes by the name of ATN International. They're really a telecom holding company with telecom assets all over the world. Geoverse is the US operation, if you will, and we're split into 3 business units. One of those being the service provider solution business, which is depicted in the picture on the right. And that business is primarily providing wholesale roaming in 15 states to the large carriers in the United States. So we fill in their footprint for them. It looks like you're on their network, you're really on ours using our spectrum. And we're also the FirstNet partner to AT&T in 4 of those states. And then for rural and broadband, along with delivering cellular service under a brand in that territory, we also provide fiber, fixed wireless broadband to rural communities in and around those 15 states. And that business is going to be growing outside of that territory here shortly. And to give you an example of how that group supports virtual learning, we're in a JV with the Navajo Tribal Utility Association. And because of COVID, a lot of the students on the largest reservation in the United States had to go to a virtual learning. And so we put up a whole bunch of sites with Nokia and provided a virtual learning experience for the Navajo Nation here recently. Part of it was using CBRS spectrum, part of it was using our own spectrum, but it's just an example of kind of a K through 12 opportunity that's happened. And then the last business unit is private networks. That's where we do most of our kind of student learning and smart city projects. It's basically a managed cellular 5G service for private LTE use to government entities like a school or a city, as well as to enterprises, is what we focus on in that side of the business, primarily using the CBRS band. So as a 30-year-old plus business, we have hundreds and hundreds of employees. Most of them are technical and support resources, as well as 24/7 knock and call center. So that's the background. So as I said, the business unit that I'm associated with is private networks, and that's where a lot of our recent projects have been, is providing K through 12 virtual learning and the smart city, smart community projects that go along with that. And typically what that involves is taking advantage of this new, relatively new piece of spectrum called the CBRS band, which is 150 megahertz of prime LTE spectrum. So first time in the history of the United States that an enterprise or a government entity like a school has access to this piece of spectrum. And then combining those with LTE radios that operate in that CBRS band, and then linking to a core that enables a cellular footprint in that community. And the other element is a fully managed, interconnected experience on top of that for the the students, teachers, and the community at large.
Okay, great. So Ray, I think most people know who Nokia is, but I'll go ahead and build your slide here if you want to do a quick introduction.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Nokia is known for being one of the largest, if not top 3 in probably every telecom area, from devices, radio access, core, IP, application, spectrum management, I would say. And then, I would say beyond the size of Nokia, I think we're also a very innovative company in trying to be at the forefront of Industrial 4.0 and, working with our Bell Labs folks, trying to stay in front of what's happening with technology. So that's the part I like working at Nokia. We're always somehow involved in new technology innovation. And then one part of Nokia that's probably not as well known, and that's if you can go to the next slide, is that we have a whole enterprise division. We have our own standalone enterprise division. Nokia's been selling to enterprise for years, mostly coming from our acquisition of Alcatel-Lucent and Bell Labs, and we've taken that customer base and portfolio and really focused now really on Industrial 4.0, and private wireless and 5G is a big piece of that, bringing the wireless connectivity to these IoT solutions. So we're a leader not just globally as far as wireless goes, but also private wireless. We've been doing private wireless actually for quite a while. In the US, the catalyst has been CBRS, having access to spectrum. But in Europe, even before LTE, GSM for rail, that was a large Nokia solution. So we've been involved with enterprise and private wireless for a while, and we're spending a lot of investment in our R&D to develop solutions that help with the enterprise business use cases. And that's a lot of my role as business development, is really understanding how private LTE and wireless solutions will help the end verticals, because it is different in utilities than it is in higher ed or K through 12 even, how they use private wireless. And it has more to do, they don't typically purchase private wireless for the connectivity. They usually purchase it for the end use case, and really understanding how these networks will be leveraged for the benefit of enterprises is my role and my goal.
Right. So I don't know if you took this photo, or are you one of the people in those in the kayaks?
No, I wish I was there right now, actually. That's probably some of our Finnish friends. They get more vacation than we do in the US.
Nokia slides, they always have a nice picture. There's always a nice picture, always. All right, so Ray, we'll just stay with you for a minute. So let's talk about use cases. So obviously education is it's a big vertical market. Obviously everything from K through 12, also universities, community colleges. There's a lot of moving pieces in there. So, and the question we always get, and it's one that we had a lot in this time in the registration was, what are the use cases? Why is education going to go to the private networking opportunity, to the market?
Yeah, and I've spent some time working with some universities and colleges and actually defining like their business outcome. And the main outcomes they're looking for are listed here. Cut the wire. A lot of folks look at a private LTE network and they think that okay, it's to replace the Wi-Fi. And in fact, really, we don't see the private LTE as a replacement for Wi-Fi. I think they work very well hand in hand. But the value in being able to not use an Ethernet cable or a fiber cable, that brings a lot of flexibility in some of the use cases, being able to move cameras around, reach, if they have fiber going to parts of the campus, being able to extend that fiber. So cut the wire is one of the main drivers behind why they're deploying private LTE. Wi-Fi does play into this, though, that there are some use cases that they would want a higher security solution. So LTE having the SIMs and the encryption at both ends, and how it's extending their existing IP network. That's also one of the areas, but also from a quality and reliability, LTE networks are a little bit more robust. So we're seeing some use cases being moved over from Wi-Fi to private LTE, and really relieving the Wi-Fi network now and reducing some of that congestion they're seeing in their campuses. And then when looking at a larger campus, actually, especially for outdoor LTE, since we can propagate at higher powers, we need less APs. So from a cost standpoint, it actually makes more sense also to look at a LTE solution, be it 4G or 5G. You require less infrastructure to cover a larger area, and so that therefore affects the cost standpoint. But also some of them are using LTE already, but they're using the public carriers networks. So some of them are looking to reduce their data plans, especially when they realize that they have a data plan and 80% of their usage of that data plan is actually on premise, on campus or at the school. And then there's also the link that to technology adoption. A lot of these universities are looking at new IoT solutions, either for smart building or even smart classrooms, leveraging AR, VR. So there's different drivers, but these are the main ones we've seen in working with the universities.
Okay. And this next slide I especially like, talking about obviously from the student point of view. I think you and I called this one the lazy teenager slide. So
yeah, this is the one that makes me dream about going back to uni and hanging out. But this is really trying to highlight what are the main use cases. Like I said, typically they're not purchasing a private LTE for the connectivity itself or just purely for broadband, though that is the case for, let's say, using it for fixed wireless, extending their fiber to maybe some student housing or some of the facilities that they don't have fiber to. They can leverage the LTE network for backhaul. But other ones like the emergency blue phone, in some states and some universities, they have these emergency phones, which are really just phone booths, copper-based phone booths, and the carriers are pulling back those services. Some of them they only have till the end of this year to replace them. So they're looking at more innovative ways to still keep the security aspect of these blue phones in the campus, but now they're looking at two-way video, or even some of them are looking at them as a digital billboard station where they can even put advertising on it and actually be a revenue generating, but still keep the emergency capabilities. And and looking at voice communication, not having to have a separate push to talk network, maybe aggregating their different wireless services on one network. And then some are more creative in the AR, VR smart classroom standpoint. And then, then the larger universities that have stadiums are looking at it, a whole bunch of other use cases from point of sale to interactive services in the stadium itself. So a lot of different use cases and IoT solutions are driving the business.
Great. So Jim, so back to you. I know this is something you've talked about as well, as this interplay between the education opportunity and then the city infrastructure as well.
Yeah, and where Ray was kind of talking about a lot of higher ed use cases, I think we're probably seeing more opportunities right now in the K through 12 arena, and I think that has a lot to do with COVID and virtual learning and the money available for the digital divide students. But along with kind of some of the things I talked about before, the other important thing and why all this activity is happening, this K through 12 digital divide broadband using CBRS and Smart SMITI, is the private cellular network starting point, if you will, and that's a coming together of a partnership between, let's say, the school district, the city, and sometimes the county that the school district is in. And often when this partnership comes together, it's a beautiful thing, by the way, you find that all these assets, fiber, rooftops of schools, rooftop of fire station, towers and poles, are all available. And that means that you have the absolute, backbone for a private cellular network right there. And on top of that, unlike, building a network with a public carrier, the zoning and the construction permitting and all that takes a fraction of the time that it does. So you're seeing some of these networks pop up all because of this right now. And like I said, it's primarily happening in K through 12, but the higher ed kind of looks a little similar to this. It's just that I don't think their access to the money right now is the same as with K through 12.
It's funny to say that. I actually did an interview the other day with an IT guy from a municipal government city up in South Dakota, and he was actually saying the same thing, that using the infrastructure in the city already for multiple users. He was talking about police, fire, but also he brought in the education angle to that as well. And we should point out to people, this chart is fuzzy by design. I actually asked Jim if he got the wrong chart, but he said no, he wanted it that way. So you also talked about the digital divide. And I know you've done a lot of different use cases as well, but using CBRS here, you just want to walk through what you're showing here. You've got obviously a few components here on school bus, etc.
Yeah, and again, very K through 12 focused. And again, this is how CARES Act money, and aside from CARES Act money, you're seeing grants and contribution from the Googles, et cetera, for Chromebooks and things like that. But once you create this private cellular network with the city assets, the radios, the core, all that, what you've really created is this private network for the community. However, the use case that's paying for all this, and the kind of the most urgent use case, is just getting true broadband connectivity for students that can't afford it. Because I've talked to cities and schools, and upwards of 10,000 students sometimes don't show up to school because they don't have a broadband connection and everything's virtual. So how are you going to tackle this problem? And they're primarily tackling this problem in one of two ways. Either they just get a dongle or a MiFi device and they cut a deal with an existing public cellular company or MVNO of that public cellular company, and they try and take care of it. But again, that's not a private network. Oftentimes they're getting throttled, and in apartment buildings, you may have dozens and dozens of students in the sector of that cell site. So there's a real movement to do this private, because remember, they have cellular, they have the opportunity to really pass some incredible bandwidth and have a true virtual learning experience. So this use case of giving a student a laptop, a Chromebook, combining with a hotspot-like device, CBRS on one side, Wi-Fi on the other, so that the students and family can connect to it, primarily for school, and, depending on the filtering requirements of that school district, they open for other things. But the primary use case is school. And then when you get into rural areas, oftentimes, like what we had to do on the Navajo Nation, there are students that live hundreds of miles, and you can't get to every house. So you set up these hotspots on school buses, and students in other places, but students then drive to those, and that's kind of their classroom during this virtual learning environment. And the trend is, we hope COVID all ends, but I think a lot of schools are saying that this may end, but they don't think that everyday school is going to be the norm going forward. There'll be a couple days a week where and even doing homework online is important. And if you don't have a broadband connection, well, that's going to be a differentiator and not what this program is all about. So that's kind of the explanation of the side.
Okay, great. So Ray, back over to you. So let's shift to, we talked about the why, we talked about the use case. Let's talk a little bit about the how. The many, 4G, 5G comes in many flavors here, slide. But how does this all fit together? Which, we get this question a lot, is what do I need? What network should I use? Right?
Yeah, and that's the thing that's kind of been interesting with 2020. Two major introductions. The 5G maybe not wasn't introduced in 2020, but it really came to a little bit more mature, is the 5G introduction, and then the private LTE CBRS introduction. So there's two things that are occurring that are benefiting enterprise, and there's different ways that they can take advantage of this. All the way from on the top of this slide, it shows fully owned. Now that there is CBRS and you can have access to your own spectrum, you don't have to bid for licensed spectrum or lease it out. Well, then now a school district or a university or an enterprise can now fully own their own network, the same way they can own their own routers and Wi-Fi APs and IP networks. And the components of that are the radios, but first even start with the components, the devices, the end devices, and with band 48 being so popular, I would say majority, if not all, the device manufacturers will now have band 48 radio. You can Google Pixel, iPhone, to the Cradle Points and Nokias and all the other CPEs. So there's a lot of devices available, radios. Some innovation that occurs within enterprise network is there's different models for the core now. There's centralized core, the same way carriers done it for years. There's new cloud-based cores available. You can go to Google or Amazon or Microsoft and get their solutions for cloud core. And then there's, they can own their own core, virtual core on premise. And then, there's pros and cons to each of these. And then you can go down to where you could maybe own the devices and the radios, but outsource the core to, I think Geoverse has a model that way where, they can purchase the radios, but use Geoverse's capabilities managing a core and everything that comes with doing that. And then there's also some shared models where even the radios, they can own some of their radios in certain facilities. Maybe indoor, they would look at as they would own their own radios, but then outdoor use the MNO. So there's different options for different enterprises as to how they would gain access to a private network. I guess I'll say it that way, and how they would procure it. So there's of course pros and cons to each.
Right. And I think the other one is the fixed wireless aspect of this as well, which comes in, especially for K through 12. right?
Yeah, so fixed wireless, Nokia's been engaged in fixed wireless for a while, but again, mostly working with ISPs or WISP, wireless ISPs. And if you would ask me at this time last year, would K through 12 school district, the vertical, be the leading vertical for private LTE? I was a no. I mean, it was not on our radar at the beginning of the year. It wasn't on my radar. And then COVID hit and it changed. And when it first came, I was asked to investigate, work with school districts to really understand, is this a knee-jerk reaction, or what's the need? Why is such demand? And so I worked with them, and the requirements we got from them is they wanted the fast, secure broadband for students and teachers. They wanted something that was easy installation. They didn't want to become LTE experts. That was some of their fear at first of private LTE, that they may have to be go send a whole bunch of folks to go get trained as engineers and technicians. So we understood that. And beyond the cost or getting the access was content and device control management. We got some anecdotal stories about how they sent out the carrier Wi-Fi hotspots, and kids were pulling the SIMs out and selling the SIMs on the side for access, which I thought they should contact that kid and make sure he goes to get his MBA in business school. He was a pretty sharp kid, but they did have issues that some of the government funding is tied to being able to control the content. And though that is possible you can call your AT&T and get that content and device control, but it usually comes at a cost. Right. To get a VPN set up and so on. And the other piece, the piece that was interesting was they wanted a ability to track students' usage and attendance, because I think Jim mentioned it earlier. That is how some schools are getting paid, and it's very important for them to be able to measure and certify that these students are coming in and getting they're part of the student body and they're being counted. Since they're not coming into the schools, it's different in all states. Some states have reopened, some haven't. So that was another aspect of that was kind of the base requirements. So we came up with a technology solution, which is using LTE as the backhaul, and then connecting to a device that receives the LTE at the home, but then transmits Wi-Fi. And the other requirement we got was they didn't want any data limits. They didn't want to be throttled, and they wanted to meet the requirements if they were on Zoom calls that their kids were able to successfully log in and do a Zoom call, and no limits on the number of subscribers. They wanted it, if they're going to buy a network, they want to make sure that they can grow with this network and they can add their own subscribers, take them off, remove them. And the price point we were asked was to try and do this at less than $20 a month, which is feasible with some schools that have enough students. If it's 5 rural students in North Dakota, chances are we wouldn't be able to reach that price point. But surprisingly enough, even a lot of the rural school systems that we've sold to have 1,500 to 2,000 students serve. And to Jim's point earlier, that even in rural areas, something that I really hadn't realized till we started working with them was we can't necessarily meet the requirements of the entire school district, but we were able to cover 70% of their population within that price point, because there is a level of density even in rural areas. So to me, it was interesting. That's been the main vertical I've been focused on in the last 6 months, and watching, when you explain to them that a private LTE network is just an extension of their IP network, the light kind of lights up, and they feel a little bit more secure because they understand IT and IP. The school districts that we typically deal with, the IT manager or the CIO or whoever's responsible for their IT network. And if you go to the next slide, I think that one that shows the infrastructure.
Next one's Jim, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I'll get back to that, but we'll get back to the point. But the point is I was also surprised at the robustness of their fiber network. School districts have, very good fiber networks connecting to schools. And the other point on the schools I wanted to make was, though there's the e-learning because of COVID, the digital divide is really the main focus. A lot of these school districts that are moving forward now is that the homework gap, new term that I hadn't heard of before, is really what they want to address. Is all these kids that come into school, they get these Chromebooks and then go home, but when they go do their homework, everything's on the cloud, and they can't complete their homework because they don't have access to the internet.
Yep. Yeah, actually, we'll come back to your fiber slide in a second. So, Jim, Ray set you up there talking about the core and support and all those things. So if I'm the school district, I've built my network here on my university, how do I support it? How do I support what I've built? And I'll go maybe build the slide for you.
That's a great lead-in question. And Ray, I don't know about you, but one of the challenges for a school district, any government entity right now, is getting headcount budget to add IT personnel. It's just not happening. So they don't have, combination of cellular and IT experience people that they can spare. So how do you create a support and operations mechanism for this? And that's typically, with a partner. And I listed kind of the 6 key things that a school district or city looks for. They want a 24/7 support element, not only to kind of upgrade their network, upgrade their radio software, all that kind of stuff, but they want somebody to call and to do proactive management. The other thing is, you're giving the driving use case is the digital divide. You got to give a student something that they can create a Wi-Fi hotspot. You have to put a SIM card in that. That's part of the kitting experience. You have to provision it. Somebody's got to do that. And then the management of those devices, like organizing when a student calls with a problem, the school certainly doesn't want to have to take care of that. So somebody needs to take care of all that kind of stuff. And it's often overlooked when you have an infrastructure discussion like this, but to the schools and the cities, it's very, very important to have this. And so the service part becomes as important as the infrastructure and the enablement side of this.
Right. So you've got number 3 on there is tier 2 and tier 3 tech support. Who's doing tier 1? Is that usually the school? So if a student has a problem, who are they calling? Are they calling you or calling the school first?
Yeah, you're calling a network operation or call center via us, depending on how the school or city wants to set it up. And then there's technical support backing up that call center to do some of this. But the school absolutely does not want to field. They're not staffed to prepare to deal with, let's say, the students that may have these devices. And so a lot of times, even the device manufacturer will have support elements, and it's just a matter of kind of codifying that and put it together in a package that makes the school feel comfortable about this, and they can minimize the resources that they have to use for this.
Right. And obviously it's going to differ here if it's a elementary school. Probably a high school has got more support versus a college is going to have even more than that, yeah. Right? So it's going to vary.
Yeah, and typically you don't deal with an individual school, you deal with a school district, and right. Sometimes it's a combination of school districts. It could be. I don't see too many private schools, but I see public schools with charter schools and that sort of thing as a combination of school districts. Yeah. But if you my next slide, I think this is the other side of the story, is that now that you got Nokia and I all messed up here. So go ahead, Ray.
Mm-hmm. You can skip this part. I think we already talked about it.
Yeah. So this is Ray. This is where you were talking about they've got good fiber, right?
Yeah. We can go to the next slide.
Yeah. Actually,
no, sorry. I thought you had another Geoverse one. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. So this
one, then we'll go back to Ray.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, go. I'm sorry to get you out of order there, Ray. But right. This is really the exciting part of the story, in my opinion, because now that you have this private network, built on your fiber backbone, built, with radios on your city assets, that was, be honest, it's paid by federal money right now or by grants. you have this this network, this broadband connectivity network for the community, and you can do a lot of stuff with it. So you know, if you go around the infield with the pictures, one of the more simpler things, I think Ray pointed this out, is you could put up surveillance cameras without having to rip up street and do fiber links to those cameras, because you got that CBRS connectivity. This whole IoT sensor thing that all these cities have been planning for, but nobody wanted to raise their taxes to pay for it. Well, guess what? It's now there and available for you. So you can create efficiency by putting IoT sensors on your city buses, your traffic signals, on things like that. And then on top of that, citizen services such as Wi-Fi hotspots, parks, you know, simple things like that. You now have this CBRS backbone that enables this. You also, in Arizona, public pools are a big thing. So a lot of times the temperature is not right in the pool, or the pool water quality isn't good. Well, now the public can know about that through these surveillance sensors that, you know, you can create a messaging thing around. Also, think about this as cost avoidance. You have a number of tablets and phones that these city workers, parking police people, regular police people, mobile data terminals, those can all now be part of this private network. And so you're looking at this from a cost avoidance angle. On top of that, some of these cities are planning on using this to create an innovation zone out of their city, attracting jobs like high-tech jobs, attracting universities to this area. It's kind of a growth stimulus for the city. So, and that to me is really exciting. And that's maybe not the 2020 story, but maybe the end of 2021 story, how you're going to see all these cities take advantage of a network that was primarily paid for because of the digital divide, but you have all this future coming to life. And then the final piece of the story is it's a real estate story. And it's quite different than you and I and Ray imagined starting 2019 or starting 2020. Their real estate play becomes the city, and you have a radio network and a core network that you're capable of sharing with other service providers. So what that means is you have a way to create a monetization from this if you do it the right way. If you don't think of this as just I want to do a down and dirty fixed network. If you do it the right way, you have an opportunity to monetize this thing with other carriers that want to take advantage of your real estate asset that you have. And so that's the final thought I have there, Ray. I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, no, we call it use case stacking. Sorry?
Okay. Jim, I was actually going to ask you, the guy standing in the middle there, the top photo, it looks like he's standing on a roof drinking a beer. I didn't see what the application was there.
Yeah, he's from Chicago, so that's the first thing they do summer is they drink a beer before they go to work.
Okay. So Ray, I'll go back to your so this is the last slide we had. Actually, we kind of reworked the order a little bit, but some of the enablers here, we've talked about a lot of them here, but here you get a little bit more technical in terms of throughputs and things.
Well, the reason I brought this up is, it's probably, if it's not the first question, is the second question that school districts ask is, how many sites am I going to need, and how much can each students get in throughput, and what kind of capacity? So, LTE or 5G is a radio technology, so it's the real answer is it depends, but they don't like that answer. So we have to come up with a rule of thumb and kind of say, look, okay, here's, using CBRS as your spectrum, you're going to be limited based on what the FCC limits from a power standpoint. Mm-hmm. And then that'll kind of tell you the distance. So we use 1.5 kilometers as really your radius of what you should expect. course, there's deltas, and it depends how high, how much foliage, and all the what ifs. But we've found that 1.5 is a good rule of thumb. And so you get about 7 square kilometers from one site location, usually a school, where they're going to put the site. And then there's ways to increase capacity. So spectrum in the CBRS goes in 10 megahertz. Our radio actually is a minimum 20 megahertz channel. And then the amount of megahertz you have decides how much throughput you can get. You can go online and look at the theoretical model. I think it's 150 megabits per second down and about 20 megabits per second up, but that's the theoretical. And then what we've said, it was shown is like, look, you can create these sectors. That's the one thing about, LTE and the cellular systems and 5G is that you can create these sectors that you can hand over between sectors if you're on a mobility type use case. But in fixed wireless, you create these sectors, you create these antennas that point in different directions so that you can reuse spectrum and channels. And Nokia has a high capacity radio. We have 2 outdoor radios, a standard capacity radio and a high capacity radio that actually can have 4 20 megahertz channels. And then each of these sectors can have 4. So this is where it shows 4, users supported by spectrum per cell. If you have 2 channels, that's 40 megahertz. You have 4 channels per sector, that's 80. So we've come up with this rule of thumb. And the interesting thing for us is we've seen RFPs and we've seen requirements come for peak user rates of 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up. And we view that's part of the RBOF and the rural community, the digital divide requirements from the federal government. But most students do not use 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up. A typical Zoom call is probably more in the range of 3 to 5 megabits down and 1 to 1.5 megabits up. So we view this rule of thumb as being actually very conservative. But this gives a school district, an understanding of, within this 7 square kilometer range, how many students am I going to hit? And then of the amount of students there, how many sectors do I need and how many channels am I going to need to be able to reach these peak rates? And by the way, we also have something called oversubscription, which is even if you have 100 students in a sector, the chances are that those 100 students demanding, packet requests to the network simultaneously is pretty much very rare. So we use a 20% or 5 times oversubscription that can expand the amount of students you serve within a sector. So this has helped us in the conversations with the school districts for them to better understand, what's my coverage going to be like? How many sites am I going to need to cover, my student base? And then, what kind of capacity requirements? Now, I have to say, there's probably only Nokia, Ericsson, and Huawei, and Huawei doesn't exist in the US anymore, so forget them. I guess I'll throw maybe Samsung, but they don't really exist in the US yet, that have a high capacity radio. So these 4 channels per sector is limited. You have to check with your OEM vendor to make sure they can provide that.
Right. And it's actually interesting that 1.5 kilometer radius there, 7 kilometers squared. I was just thinking, I live west of Austin, and what you're saying about putting the radios on top of the school, use the property you already own. Just think about where our elementary schools are, middle schools and high schools. You could actually cover most of the school district just by using their own property.
Yeah, we came with 70%. Typically, it averages out at 70%. They can cover their base. And by the way, that 1.5 kilometer is looking at it from a non-line of sight solution, right, which is actually kind of an important point because, we have a outdoor, we call it fast mile ODU, but an outdoor antenna solution that you can put on the outdoor of the building or a windowsill. And if you have line of sight, the WISP or wireless ISP customers are providing services for customers that are 4 or 5 miles away, using CBRS, but that has to be line of sight environment. So the schools are not interested for the most part, or try to reduce the amount of outdoor devices as a solution. So they want an indoor MiFi or an indoor gateway. So that's why we have a more conservative range, but they can go beyond that with CBRS if they use an outdoor line of sight solution.
Right. Okay, great. So what I'm going to do here, we've got several questions. I'm going to skip my summary slide. I'll leave that for the end. So if you do have any questions, use the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. We've got a few here. A couple of them I think you know probably coming. They usually come up. But the first two are very specific to each of you. So Jim, you first. For Geoverse, how does the billing work for your services? So you've got the core and all the different pieces here. So you mentioned Navajo Nation as an example. How's that structured from a billing point of view? Obviously not what the price is, but rather how does it work from a usage point of view, etc.
So with the Navajo Nation, that's an example of us being a cellular carrier acting as a public cellular carrier. So you're basically creating with CARES Act money, you're creating almost a $0 fee for the students to use this, you know, because they don't have broadband now. So you know, there's other things that go in, but it's typical cellular bill type process. When we're building a private network for a school or for a city for their own use, it all depends on how much support they want, devices. More often than not, they want to use that money now. So we create a path for them to use that money now with X number of years of service associated with it. And so it varies basically. It's a short answer.
So there's multiple models available. It's not.
Yeah, there's not one model, and I think you know, I think the limit, you know, when you're talking about this federal money available, there's normally a deadline when to spend it and how you can spend it and things like that. So that's really driving a lot of the financial models. But when you're a public carrier, it's a little different in how you go about it.
Right. And so Ray, the question for you actually, I kind of smiled when I read this. I know the answer to this because we've actually about to publish an ebook on this, which you're in, you Nokia. Is Nokia open to Open RAN? So integrating different components from different vendors.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is yes. I mean, Nokia is probably one of the leaders in that area. I have to admit, my area of knowledge or technical knowledge of what we're doing in Open RAN is somewhat limited, other than I know that, you know, we see this as a strategic area for Nokia and Open RAN, and we're supporting the initiative.
I say I knew the answer. I wanted you to say it. So the other one, I'll let you both comment on this. Maybe Jim, you go first. This question always comes up. We've talked about LTE, 4G. We've talked about 5G. We've talked about different use cases. And the question is here is, do I need 5G for these types of applications? Ray's talking about 25 megs down and 3 up. So is the main opportunity with LTE, or is there a 5G component to this as well? Jim?
You want me to go first? So yeah. For the use cases that are in front of us right now, I think private LTE with the proper core location to handle the latency requirements is real. But if you look down the road, there's a couple things happening. Mainly, most of this is going up on the CBRS band. And the CBRS band is going to have 5G capability. And if you look down the road and you think about all the autonomous uses, especially, you know, necessarily with a K through 12 school, but a university or a smart city, I think that's where we'll start seeing 5G become useful and practical. And that may even be more of a story than a public cellular 5G, frankly. As that materializes.
Right. So Ray, obviously, I mean, you're talking to a lot of school districts right now, a lot of different deployments. Is there a 5G discussion there as well as the 4G discussion? How does it migrate?
Well, there's always the discussion because everybody, brings up 5G and that's their first request. The challenge, I guess, for us is the understanding of what 5G is and how spectrum is part of that story. So, our view is CBRS, it will, evolve to 5G, but there won't be significant differences between LTE 4.9 and 5G and CBRS because of the limitation of the spectrum. Now, there'll be some benefits for latency, but again, we offer a edge core solution, so therefore latency is already addressed as part of our private LTE solution in 4.9G. But there will be some improvements, but I think it will be somewhat minimal. I think we see more of a quicker evolution to 5G in the higher ed and some of their use cases. But again, the most use cases we work with today can be met with 4.9G, and there are a handful of high throughput, low latency solutions for like autonomously guided vehicles, video based actually. Autonomous guided vehicles that 5G would be probably a better solution, but most of it, at least in the private LTE side, has more to do with the spectrum limitation, and we're looking at actually other spectrum for private, such as the multi-fire, and to get those higher throughputs that 5G are capable, that the carriers will have access to because they have access to that licensed spectrum.
Right. So last question, actually, we've got a few seconds left here. It's a really fast one. It's an important one. You both talked about deployments. Ray, you said that this time last year, you didn't think you'd be looking at education as much as you are. Jim, you talked about CARES Act deployments, and that obviously that money became available halfway through last year or so. So if you were to start today, and let's just take an example of K through 12, district using CBRS, if we were to start today, how quickly could you have a network up and running? What is there a typical? Jim?
Yeah, the biggest challenge. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Well, I think the short answer is depends on how many schools you want to and how many students.
Right.
But just to give you a for instance, there are 40 site networks going up in a matter of months that would have taken years and years to build. On the Navajo reservation, we put up 108 new sites trying to make a deadline by December, and that project started, I think, in September. So all this is happening at record pace. It's not perfect at first, but the idea is, you have this money with a deadline, but we'll use it and we'll figure out where we need to make amends, after that. So that's kind of the prevailing thought. And, having a public cellular background, I never thought this could have been done, but it's being done, and it's being done in multiple places. But if you do it like you put up a site on a school building that has fiber and you have a cloud core connection, you can do this in a matter of days, actually. Yeah. But it's often more than one site is the story.
Right.
Yeah. Looking at building up a network, lead time is usually, equipment delivery and civil construction. Our index solution, our Nokia Digital Automation Cloud, is a pre-configured solution. So literally, I go around with my own kit and I can turn up a network in 3 hours. So that's it's not the turning up that takes really a lot of time. It's usually contract negotiations and then the civil aspect of physically installing the radios, let's say on a tower or a pole or on top of the building. That's the longest lead time. The network, getting the network up and running is within the day.
Great. Well, gentlemen, thanks very much. For everybody on the phone still, obviously growing opportunity here. We talked about a lot of the growth it's like the demand here is real. It's probably something that's going to outlast COVID here. This is a longer term solution. And we talked about the use cases for student, faculty, the community at large. CBRS, both of you have mentioned that a lot. It comes up as a major enabler. We're just talking about the speed of deployment there. You know, that connected school becomes part of this bigger connected community. You call it smart city, whatever you first. My view on smart city is it's very difficult to build it top down. You build it bottom up. So you have smart people in smart buildings on smart campuses becomes a smart city. And obviously the school can be a part of that. The university can be part of that. And obviously leveraging the one network for multiple users we talked about from a fiber perspective. If anybody has any further questions, let me know. I will direct you to Jim and Ray, but Jim Jacobellis from Geoverse, thank you very much. Ray Saverin from Nokia. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.